The memory clings to the silence of that night like smoke. Inside the barracks, where cots lined the walls and shadows pressed against the windows, a faint glow suddenly appeared, trembling yet stubborn against the dark. A candle placed on a small piece of cake was carried gently through the rows of prisoners by a young American guard who barely looked older than the women themselves. For a moment, the air thick with homesickness and distrust softened into something unthinkable. The women leaned forward, their eyes catching the golden flame, and realized one of their own was being honored. A birthday, acknowledged in captivity, in enemy territory, when even in their last years at home, the Reich had no room left for such simple celebrations. Laughter crept in, hesitant at first, then fuller, like a language they had almost forgotten how to speak. That night, the war did not end, but it bent under the fragile weight of humanity. If you feel the power of these forgotten stories, these quiet contradictions of war that reveal how even enemies could hold fragments of kindness, then I ask you to join us in keeping them alive. Like, share, and subscribe, not for numbers, but for memory. Each voice, each face, each small candle in the dark deserves to be remembered, and your support helps ensure their light is not extinguished. Now let us walk step by step through their journey, where the ruins of a collapsing empire gave way to unexpected dignity across the ocean. The last weeks of the Reich had already stripped the women of certainty, but surrender stripped them of even the illusion of control. The collapse did not sound like a gunshot or an explosion. It was quieter, heavier, like the sigh of a country that could no longer hold itself upright. They stood in fields and crumbling town squares, uniforms still clinging to their bodies, though the insignia had already lost its meaning. The American jeeps arrived not with vengeance carved into their faces, but with an expression of exhaustion that mirrored their own. Orders were shouted, possessions confiscated, and suddenly the women who once belonged to the German Auxiliary Corps were no longer soldiers but prisoners. They walked forward with their hands raised, not toward glory or cause, but toward a life they did not know if they were permitted to continue. Dust clung to them in layers, turning even the younger girls into ghosts of themselves. Hunger made their steps uneven, the hollows of their cheeks sharper than helmets ever could be. Propaganda had promised them that capture would mean dishonor worse than death, that American soldiers would tear away dignity with violence and cruelty. And so they braced themselves, their hearts beating not with defiance, but with dread. Yet the first hours of captivity did not match the terrifying stories. Instead of blows, they were met with silence and orders spoken in steady, almost indifferent tones. Their uniforms were taken, their hair searched for lice, their names written down in neat columns on American clipboards. Each name, once shouted in drill or whispered in secrecy, now became a line of ink in an enemy's language. The transport trains waited like iron beasts, their doors yawning open, ready to swallow the defeated. Women were herded inside, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the stale air thick with breath and fear. Through narrow slats in the wood, the ruins of Germany passed them by in fragments. The skeleton of a church, a field littered with broken glass, a child standing barefoot in the rubble of what might once have been a street. Each fragment cut deep, for they knew they might never see those places again. The Reich had told them that death was better than capture, but as the train rattled westward, many found themselves praying quietly, not for death, but for survival. One woman, Marta, clutched a small diary hidden beneath her skirt. The book was no larger than her hand, its pages thin, its cover worn smooth by years of war. She pressed it close as the train jolted forward, scribbling lines in the dimness whenever she could. She wrote of the silence between her comrades, of the strange calm of the American guards who smoked their cigarettes with an ease that made them seem untouchable. She wrote of her shame at the hunger that made her steal a piece of crust from another's bag, and of her astonishment that no American raised a hand when she was caught. To write was to remind herself that she was still more than a number, still capable of memory. Days stretched into one another, measured only by the stops where prisoners were transferred from train to truck, from truck to holding pens. Sleep came in snatches, dreams blurred by the rattle of wheels and the echo of foreign commands. Yet beneath the fear, something unexpected began to settle in, a question. Why had the Americans not unleashed the brutality they had been promised? Why did they offer water without spitting into it, bread without poison? The women did not dare speak these thoughts aloud, but in their silence they carried the unease of realization. Perhaps everything they had been told about the enemy was unraveling. By the time they reached the larger holding camp, the women's uniforms no longer looked like uniforms at all. Buttons were missing, hems torn, insignia scraped away until only faint outlines remained. Their clothing had become rags of memory, symbols of a past that seemed less and less real with every passing hour. The gates of the camp closed behind them, and with that sound, their old identities closed as well. They were auxiliaries no longer, not secretaries of the Reich, not signals officers or nurses. They were prisoners, reduced, anonymous, but alive. And though their pride ached at the humiliation, the simple fact of survival glowed faintly beneath the layers of dust and despair. Marta opened her diary once more in the barracks, scratching words into the thin paper by the faint light of a lantern. "We are not treated as beasts," she wrote, her hand trembling with disbelief. "We are watched, counted, commanded, but not broken, not yet." She closed the book quickly when footsteps approached, hiding it beneath her blanket as though it were contraband more dangerous than any weapon. That night, lying on a cot that creaked with every breath, she listened to the quiet murmurs of the other women. Some cried softly, calling names that would never answer again. Others lay silent, their eyes wide in the dark. Marta stared at the ceiling, her hunger gnawing, her mind circling around a single truth she could not yet shape into words. The end of uniforms was not the end of dignity. Something was beginning, though none of them yet knew what it would become. The sea stretched before them like an endless sheet of steel, shifting and restless beneath the sky. When the women were led up the gangway of the transport ship, they expected chains, cramped cells, and the promise of misery at every turn. Instead, they were directed into large holds fitted with bunks, bare but sufficient. The clang of boots on metal, the low rumble of the engines, and the faint salt smell of the ocean marked the beginning of their crossing. It was not freedom, it was not kindness, but neither was it the cruelty their minds had rehearsed. The Atlantic was vast, and with each hour it pulled them further from the ruins of their homeland. From the deck, under guard, they glimpsed waves rising like black walls and falling into foam. The horizon stretched without end, and with it, the distance between who they had been and who they were becoming. Marta wrote in her diary again, her words crooked from the ship's sway. "The ocean does not know war. It swallows everything. We might vanish, and no one would know." She hid these pages quickly, tucking them beneath her thin mattress, fearful that even thoughts could be confiscated. Food came in lines, metal trays passed along, portions heavier than what most of them had eaten in months, potatoes, meat, bread, still soft in the center. Some women ate quickly, desperate, ashamed of their hunger. Others hesitated, staring at their plates, as if waiting for the trap to reveal itself. A rumor passed through the hold that the food was poisoned, that the generosity was a trick. Yet hours became days, and none fell ill. Slowly, suspicion gave way to the primal need to eat. The taste of real nourishment, greasy, filling, foreign, awakened both relief and guilt. For how could the enemy feed them better than their own nation had in its final days? The voyage was not free of fear. Each time a hatch opened, hearts clenched with expectation. Would this be the moment of humiliation? Would they be dragged out, punished, erased? But the footsteps that approached were steady, businesslike, and often passed without confrontation. Guards smoked on the deck, their laughter carried by the wind, sounding more like boys than monsters. They did not leer or strike. They watched, they counted, they herded. Yet, beyond that, they seemed strangely detached, as though the women were not enemies but responsibilities. That indifference unsettled them more than hatred might have. Nights were the hardest. The rocking of the ship made sleep shallow, and in the darkness, whispers spread like smoke. Some women spoke of home, of mothers and brothers lost under the rubble of Dresden or Hamburg. Others spoke of fear, that America would parade them as trophies, that they would be forced into labor camps where death would be slow. And then there were those who said nothing at all, their silence heavier than words. Marta often found herself lying awake, staring into the dark, listening to the creak of metal and the faint, ceaseless churn of the sea. She tried to imagine what awaited them on the other shore, but her mind could not conjure the shape of America. On rare occasions, the women were brought above deck for air. The sight of the horizon stretched around them like a prison with no walls, the sea a desert without end. Seagulls wheeled overhead, and for a moment the women lifted their faces to the salt spray as though it carried a memory of freedom. Marta described it in her diary. For a moment I forgot I was a prisoner. I could have been anyone, anywhere, staring at the endless sea. But then I saw the guards at the rail, and I remembered. Days blurred together in the rhythm of meals, inspections, and the ship's endless roll. Time seemed to dissolve, replaced by the constant hum of engines and the slap of waves. Yet within that monotony, something began to shift. The women noticed that the guards sometimes offered small gestures, an extra ladle of stew, a cigarette, passed quietly to a trembling hand. No words of comfort were spoken, but the absence of cruelty began to feel like its own strange form of kindness. It was disorienting, for it clashed with everything they had been taught to expect. As the journey stretched on, Marta's diary entries grew more fragmented, filled with questions she could not answer. Why do they treat us this way? Are we not their enemies? Do they not hate us? She closed her writing with a line she dared not read aloud. Perhaps hatred is not as simple as we were told. When the coastline finally emerged one morning, a faint strip of green and grey against the horizon, the women crowded to the portholes, straining for a glimpse. America, the land of the enemy, the land of myths and propaganda, the land they had never thought they would see. The ship slowed, and a hush fell over them, not of fear this time, but of awe. Whatever awaited them there, they knew it would not be what they had imagined. The ocean had carried them beyond the reach of certainty, and now the unknown loomed as vast as the sea itself. The ship slid into harbour at dawn, its engines sighing as if weary from the crossing. Mist rose from the water, veiling the coastline in a pale curtain that slowly revealed cranes, warehouses, and the faint outline of buildings reaching toward the sky. For the women pressed against the rail, America looked both ordinary and impossible. Dock workers in overalls, gulls swooping low, the distant rhythm of a city stirring awake. This was no monstrous place of cruelty, no arena of torment as the Reich had warned. It was simply another shore, alive with industry, breathing with its own unshaken confidence. The disembarkation began with the sharp bark of commands. But even those commands carried a tone that was brisk rather than brutal. The women filed down the gangway in silence, their steps unsteady after weeks at sea. Guards flanked them, rifles slung at their shoulders, but their faces betrayed no hatred, only focus. For Marta, each step onto the wooden dock felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The boards creaked beneath her boots, smelling of tar and salt, and when she lifted her eyes, she saw American civilians watching from a distance, curiosity in their gaze rather than malice. From the docks they were loaded into trucks, canvas flaps drawn tight against the morning chill. The ride stretched through landscapes unlike any Marta had known. Fields rolled past, green and unscarred by bomb craters. Houses stood whole, their windows unshattered, their roofs untouched by fire. Children played in yards, waving at the convoy as though it were a parade. For the women who had left behind the ruins of German cities, the sight was unbearable in its simplicity. Abundance lay everywhere, unthreatened, while their own homeland had been reduced to smoke and rubble. At last the trucks slowed before tall fences and guard towers, the outline of a camp rising neatly from the earth. But where they expected barbed wire and mud, they found rows of barracks built with precision, grounds swept clean, and pathways lined with gravel. It was prison, yes, but prison with order. The gates opened, the trucks rolled in, and the women were ushered out to stand in rows. Their names were taken once more, their possessions catalogued, and then they were led inside. The first shock came with the showers. They were herded into a washroom where water thundered down in steady streams, hot enough to sting their skin. Soap was pressed into their hands, smooth, fragrant, absurdly gentle. Marta turned the bar over, inhaling its faint, floral scent, unable to remember the last time she had touched such a thing. She rubbed it across her arms and watched grey rivulets run down her body, carrying months of dirt into the drains. Around her, women gasped, laughed nervously, some weeping as though the simple act of being clean was more than their hearts could bear. When they emerged, towels wrapped around them, clean uniforms awaited. The fabric was coarse but whole, free of holes or patches. For the first time in years, they stood not in rags but in garments unscarred by war. Their reflection in the barrack windows startled them, faces still gaunt, eyes still shadowed, but cleaner, straighter, more human than they had allowed themselves to believe. Meals followed, and with them another fracture in their expectations. In the mess hall, trays were filled with food that seemed almost decadent. Bread still warm from ovens, meat sliced thick, beans and vegetables piled high. The women hesitated, staring at their plates as if unsure whether it was meant for them. Some burst into tears at the sight, overwhelmed by hunger and the sudden abundance. Others ate slowly as though each bite might vanish if they rushed. The guards watched, saying little, but their restraint spoke louder than cruelty could have. Marta recorded the moment that night in her diary, her handwriting steadier now that her stomach was full. "We are treated as though we are not enemies," she wrote. "It is a prison, yes, but one with blankets, bread, and even kindness in small measures. I cannot understand it. I want to be grateful, but I am afraid of what gratitude means." As the days passed, the women settled into the strange rhythm of camp life. Roll call at dawn, work details in the fields or kitchens, evenings spent in barracks that were plain but dry. Nights brought the sound of crickets instead of bombers, the sight of stars unbroken by searchlights. The contrast gnawed at them. How could their captors provide such dignity while their own nation had left them starving in ruins? It was a question with no answer, and yet it lingered in every glance, every bite of bread, every bar of soap. One evening, as Marta lay on her cot, she whispered to the woman beside her, "If this is captivity, what does freedom look like?" The other woman said nothing. only turned her face away. But Marta knew the silence was not ignorance, it was fear. Fear of admitting that captivity here seemed gentler than the freedom awaiting them in a homeland reduced to ashes. The camp gates stood tall, a constant reminder that they were still prisoners. Yet within those gates, they had begun to taste a dignity they had thought lost forever. And as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected waited to break through the fragile calm. The flicker of a candle in the dark, and the celebration of a life in the most unlikely of places. The barracks had settled into a rhythm, a muted heartbeat that pulsed with the sameness of each passing day. Wake at dawn, roll call, work details, meals that filled but never quite satisfied, and nights of uneasy rest beneath the wooden rafters. Time blurred inside the camp, measured less by calendars than by seasons shifting in the fields beyond the wire. Yet one night, that monotony cracked open, and through the fissure slipped something so strange, so profoundly human, that it left the women disoriented. It began with whispers. A young prisoner, Elise, had her birthday approaching, though in Germany the day had long since become just another shadow under war. Few had celebrated birthdays in the Reich's final years. Hunger had consumed such traditions, leaving only scraps of memory. Elise herself had forgotten until a nurse, an American, asked her age and noted the date with a faint smile. No one thought much of it at the time, yet on the night itself, when the barracks grew still and the lamps burned low, the door opened quietly. A guard stepped in, cradling something small in his hands. It was a cake, not a grand one, not frosted in excess or layered in cream, just a modest circle of sponge with a thin glaze across its top. But on it stood a single candle, flickering uncertainly in the draught of the open door. For a moment, the women did not breathe. The sight seemed impossible, almost cruel in its tenderness. The guard placed it on a table and, in halting German, announced the name of the birthday girl. Elise froze, her face burning, unable to rise from her cot. The silence broke when one of the other prisoners nudged her forward, and she stepped toward the cake as if approaching a miracle. The guard struck a match and lit the candle anew. Its flame wavered, sending shadows sprawling across the barrack walls, turning the cots and blankets into a cathedral of sorts. The women gathered closer, their eyes wide, some with tears already glistening. And then, softly at first, almost hesitant, a few voices began to sing. It was the German birthday song, half forgotten, broken by laughter and emotion. The sound rose and filled the barracks, no longer divided by uniforms or nationality. For those few minutes there was no war, no propaganda, no barbed wire. There was only a girl turning 24, and the fragile dignity of her existence being honored. Elise stood before the cake, her hands trembling, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked. She looked at the guard as though waiting for the cruel twist, the hidden mockery. But he only nodded, gesturing for her to blow out the candle. She bent forward, exhaled, and the flame vanished, leaving a ribbon of smoke curling into the air. The women clapped, some laughing nervously, others openly weeping. Elise covered her face with her hands and whispered, "I had forgotten what it feels like." Marta wrote of it that night, pressing her pencil so hard into the diary pages that the paper tore. "Our enemy remembered her birthday," she scribbled. "The Reich gave us orders, hunger, and death. These strangers give us cake." She could not decide whether to be grateful or ashamed. Gratitude felt like betrayal, yet denial felt impossible. The candle's glow lingered in her mind, burning brighter than propaganda, brighter than fear. In the days that followed, the women spoke of little else. Some argued it was manipulation, a calculated gesture to soften their spirits. Others insisted it was genuine, an act of kindness untethered from politics. But beneath their debates lay the undeniable truth: they had been seen. Their names were not just numbers on clipboards, their days were not vanishing into anonymity. To be recognized on a birthday was to be reminded that they were still individuals, still human, still alive in ways that war had tried to erase. More birthdays followed. Sometimes a guard would arrange a small cake. Other times the nurses brought extra bread sweetened with sugar. A candle was always found, its flame standing bravely against the darkness. Each celebration was quiet, almost secretive, but its impact rippled through the camp like water in dry soil. The women began marking dates, whispering them to one another, ensuring no name would be forgotten. Within those fences, where freedom was denied, the act of remembrance became its own form of liberation, and yet the kindness unsettled them more deeply than cruelty might have. Marta confessed it in her diary. If they hated us, it would be easier. Hatred, I understand, but this kindness, it confuses everything. It forces me to wonder whether my enemy sees me more clearly than my own people ever did. She closed the book, staring at the barracks ceiling, the smoke of the candle still vivid in her memory. The war outside raged on, its outcome already shaping itself across oceans and continents. But inside the camp, a single birthday candle had lit something fragile and enduring. It was a contradiction too sharp to ignore. In captivity, they had found acknowledgement. In defeat, they had found a moment of dignity. And as the nights stretched forward, whispers began to spread, rumors of release, of return, of the crumbling homeland waiting across the sea. The candlelight that had once comforted now cast long shadows, and the women wondered what would become of them when the barracks no longer held these fragile celebrations, when the barbed wire gave way to the ruins of home. The end did not come with fanfare, nor with the clarity the women had long imagined in their dreams. It arrived as whispers first, drifting through the camp like smoke, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to ignore. Guards spoke in softer tones, nurses carried an air of finality in their gestures, and word spread. The war had ended. Germany had surrendered. The Reich, which had once seemed eternal in its reach, lay in ruins. For the women behind the barbed wire, this knowledge did not bring the surge of triumph they had once rehearsed in their imaginations. It brought silence. They gathered that evening, huddled in the barracks, listening to the muted hum of crickets outside. Marta clutched her diary. Elise sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and the others waited, as if for an announcement that would make sense of what freedom now meant. Yet freedom, as it pressed against the edges of their reality, felt more like a burden than a gift. They would be repatriated, sent back to a homeland no longer recognizable. Some imagined reuniting with family. Others feared there would be no family left at all. The Americans did not celebrate their victory before them with arrogance or cruelty. Instead, they moved with a gravity that mirrored the prisoners' own unease. Trains were being prepared, papers signed, ships arranged. The guards who had once stood distant now offered quiet farewells, small words in broken German that seemed almost reluctant to let the women go. It was not sentimentality. War does not easily allow such indulgences, but something more complicated. In captivity, both sides had glimpsed the fragile thread of humanity that ran beneath their uniforms. Letting go meant tearing it anew. The night before departure, the women were given one last meal in the camp hall. It was unremarkable. Bread, soup, a touch of butter, but it carried a finality that made it taste different. They lingered over each bite, as though storing the memory, knowing the hunger of their homeland would not offer the same. In the corner, Elise whispered that she wished she could carry the candle with her, the one from her birthday, as proof that such moments had happened. Others nodded, their silence heavy with the same desire, to take with them something that might anchor their memories when reality outside the camp proved too harsh. When dawn broke, they lined up with their belongings, each carrying more fear than luggage. The gates opened, not with the thunder of liberation, but with the quiet creak of hinges long used. They stepped through, blinking at the morning sun, feeling both lighter and heavier all at once. Beyond the camp lay trains that would carry them eastward, toward cities bombed into ash, toward families torn apart, toward a country that no longer resembled the one they had left. Some looked back at the camp as they walked, unable to reconcile that within those fences they had tasted a kind of dignity absent from the ruins awaiting them. Marta wrote her final entry as the train pulled away. Her hand shook, but her words carried the clarity of someone standing between two worlds. We leave this place not as we entered. We arrived as prisoners prepared for hatred. We leave with confusion, carrying memories of kindness we never expected. What will Germany think of us when we speak of Americans who baked us cakes, who gave us soap, who lit candles in our darkness? Will they call us liars, traitors? Or will they understand that in defeat we found pieces of our humanity preserved not by our own but by our enemies? The women fell silent as the countryside unfurled, fields stretching endlessly, the horizon distant and unknowable. For some, the thought of returning home felt like stepping into exile. For others, it was the only path left. Between the two lay a tension impossible to resolve. The war had ended, but the war within them had only begun. As the train rumbled east, Elise pressed her forehead against the glass, watching America fade behind her. She whispered a single word, so faint only Marta heard it. Gratitude not for victory, nor for defeat, but for the fragile flickers of light that had survived the storm. The diary closed on that word, its final page heavy with everything unsaid, its ink a testament to a paradox they would carry forever, that in captivity they had discovered freedom's most delicate form, and in freedom they would return to captivity of memory. The women did not know what awaited them in the ruins, nor how history would remember their time in the camp. But the memory of the candle, the soap, the bread, and the unexpected kindness of their captors would burn within them, defying war's attempt to strip them of their humanity. Between two worlds, one lost, one uncertain, they carried a truth too fragile for propaganda, too enduring to be erased.